Hello, everyone. I hope I'm live now. Welcome to Keeping the Beat, an engaging web series hosted live by TNMEA in partnership with the CMA Foundation. Tune in weeknights, Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Central Time to learn from and interact with music professionals from around the globe representing every facet of the vast world of music. Today is Monday, June 1st, 2020. My name is Robert Spring, and I'm professor of clarinet at Arizona State University. Tonight, I'll be talking with you about Clarinet Technique 101. It's a requirement, not an elective. I encourage you to interact by replying to this live video stream with your questions and comments, which I will respond to throughout the hour with the assistance of my wife, who is my moderator tonight. One disclaimer, while this is being streamed live, it will remain on the Keeping the Beat Facebook page for future reference, so as such, your comments will also remain a part of the archive. I started clarinet in sixth grade in a band situation where there were no private lessons. It was just everyone together. And I remember that the band director did all he could to help us and to keep us moving together. But that being said, there was not a lot of one-on-one interaction. In fact, the first thing I remember is that I was trying to play a chromatic scale and I couldn't figure out how to go F to F sharp. So I just half-holed the hole in the back and gave me an F sharp. I didn't realize it was actually a different fingering, and it wasn't until we had a little audition that somebody pointed out to me that, well, that fingering doesn't work. The other thing was we had a little parade on Memorial Day when the end of our seventh grade year, and I turned to the guy standing next to me and said, "Boy, doesn't it hurt when you're marching with your upper lip banging up against the mouthpiece?" And he said, "What do you mean? You put your teeth on the top of the mouthpiece," which I never knew because we hadn't had that. So that being said, I really never had any real help with this. When I was a senior in high school, I told my father I wanted to be a music major in college. And my father at first tried to discourage me because I think he was worried about the financial aspect of being a teacher and all of that. And he was a pretty successful businessman. But then when we got into it and he decided I really wanted to do this, he really helped me. One of the things that he did was he I grew up in southern Michigan, and he called the School of Music at the University of Michigan, and he asked to speak to a clarinet teacher. And luckily, they connected him with a man named John Moeller, who turned out to be an incredible mentor of mine until his death last year. And John was an incredible teacher and an incredible pedagogue in every way. So I was 17 years old. It was the fall of 1972, and my dad called, and John Mueller said, "Well, has your son ever had any lessons?" He said, "Well, not really." And he said, "Well, you should probably come over and take some lessons." So they set up a time on a Saturday, and I got in my Chevy Nova, and 1969 Chevy Nova, and drove from Jackson, Michigan to Ann Arbor. And I went to John Mueller's studio, and I started getting my clarinet out. And John said, "Well, what are you going to play for me today?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to play a piece by a composer named Weber, and it's called Granduo Concertante." Well, obviously it was Weber and Granduo Concertante, but I didn't know. So I put my reed on, and I started to play a few notes, and he said, "Whoa, whoa, have you warmed up at all?" And I said, "No, not really." I didn't really know you were supposed to warm up. So I went, he said, "Well, why don't you go downstairs to the basement? There's some practice rooms. Go play a few scales and come back up." So I walked down the stairs to the practice rooms, and I played the only scales I knew, which were just a few scales. And I came back up after about 3 minutes, and he said, "You're warmed up already?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Okay, well, why don't you start playing?" So I started playing, and he stopped me about 20 seconds in. And he said, "Wow, you really aren't very good." And I was really kind of hurt, and I didn't know what to say. And he said, "Look, I don't think this is going to work. I have some doctoral students who could teach you. Let's try that." And I said, "Well, I really want to study with you. I want to be a music major at Michigan." And he looked at me like I was half out of my mind. So I, we started talking, and he said, "Well, you really need to have some lessons. You need to learn some basic things." So I want you to go downtown to a music store down there called Hadcock Music. And those of you who are clarinets, that was Pete Hadcock's father who owned this music store in downtown Ann Arbor. So I want you to get the Behrman Book 3. It was a scale book, and I want you to learn the C major scale at a metronome marking of 60, and don't worry about the last measure where it goes up to a high C. So I said, okay. So I went down and I got the scale book, and I went home and I looked at it and I played it through a couple of times, and that was my practice for that week. I came back the next week and I started playing it, and he said, "Whoa, you didn't do what I told you to do." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? I can play this." And he then proceeded to show me how uneven it was, how I went when I went from throat tone A to B natural on the staff, that it didn't work very well, that there was a bump there, and when I went up into the altissimo register, that it was, I mean, it was all really terrible. So I ended up, he said, "I just don't think this is going to work. I'm going to give it to one of my students." And I actually got very emotional and said to him, I don't understand. I don't understand what you want." And instead of kicking me out, he spent the next 45 minutes showing me how to practice and showing me what was right and what was wrong with the clarinet. So what I'm going to talk to you about today first are some basic concepts of clarinet playing and some basic ideas before we can get into the whole technical aspect. There's a question?
Yes. What advice do you have for students who can't afford lessons?
Do everything you can to give them lessons, to get them some way. There are a lot of students, like in my case at Arizona State, I have a lot of students who want to learn how to teach, really want to learn how to teach. They want to be teachers, and they will teach for free. And I think if you are near a university where there are students, music students, I think the best thing in the world you can do is to contact them and give them some information. I'm going to do a screen share with you now, and it's a clinic that I started doing actually many years ago when I was teaching in Iowa. Uh, I started out as a band director. I taught at a little school in Iowa, Morningside College, and I taught clarinet, saxophone, bassoon, music ed, marching band, and concert band. And and I when I started teaching, I as a clarinetist, I thought, well, I can teach clarinet. That's not a problem. Until I realized that the clarinetists in my band were the weakest section, and I kept trying to figure out what's wrong with my clarinets. And so I started making a bunch of phone calls around and writing letters to famous clarinet teachers around the United States. And I was, oh heavens, I was 24 years old, and I was really naive, and I didn't really know what I should be doing. So I called my teacher at the University of Michigan, John Moeller, and the other teacher I had there, Dave Schifrin, and I talked with them about certain fundamentals. And I talked to, I got the same answers from everybody. Then I got really full of myself, and so I got the phone number for Mitchell Lurie at USC, and I called him. I called Elsa Verder. I called Robert Marcellus, and I said, "So my clarinets are terrible. What can I do to fix these problems?" Well, the first thing they said was, "Well, do you have them do a warm up every day?" And I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, they have to do long tones. And do they do scales every day?" And I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, you have to do scales. Do they do thirds, arpeggios, a tongue study?" And I said, "No." And everybody said the same thing. You need to be working on basics every day. And you need to make sure their basic concepts are straight every day. Okay, we have a couple of questions.
Well, the question actually is, what were your biggest takeaways from learning how to practice?
I'll get to that in a minute about how to practice. So I had a great colleague, and his name is Randy Kohlenberg, and he now teaches trombone at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And he and I used to go to lunch every day. And one day he said to me, "Bob, I think you're the most inconsistent player and teacher I've ever met." Well, that really took me back. It kind of hurt my feelings. But he started talking about the fact that if I had a good read and I felt good, then I could play. If I didn't have a good read and I didn't feel good about things, I couldn't play. And then if I it was the same thing with my students. He said, "I think you need to work on basic concepts to get them going." So I started doing this clinic at the beginning, and this was back in 1979 or 1980. I did something for Iowa music educators, and it was just called "How to Get Your Clarinet Section Better" or something like that. And it evolved through the years to being 10 Steps to a Better Clarinet section. And then I did a clinic for Midwest a few years ago, and I called it Clarinet Technique 101. It's a requirement, not an elective. And then my colleague, Dr. Joshua Gardner, and I did a clinic at AMEA, Arizona Music Educators, this last year. And we did the same thing, and we expanded on all of this. Now, this is all going to be made available to you uh, as we get done with this clinic. So we're going to talk about some basic concepts first that help to make everything work well on the clarinet. The first is obviously the embouchure, and we need to have an embouchure that works. And this was John Moeller's. I'll increase the size of this a little bit. This was John Moeller's actual quote. A good embouchure allows a clarinetist to produce a good sound with accurate intonation, with any articulation in any register, without a noticeable embouchure change. And we have some examples later in the booklet that I'll show you. Now, we all know, those of us who are clarinetists know our embouchure changes a little bit. But the last thing in the world you want to do is to tell a student, oh, you're going to move your embouchure some. Uh, then they'll end up having the movable embouchure thing, and they'll be able, it's just not a good thing. We want to keep that relatively set. You want the lower lip over the lower teeth. Now, I have a way that I explain it to students, and it seemed to work very well for me. And it also takes into consideration the size of everyone's lips. So you have two spots in your lip you need to be aware of. One is the pink line, which is here where your lip is pink, and the other is the wet line, which is inside here where your lip is always wet. If you can put your lower lip over your lower teeth so you can feel the top of the teeth halfway between the pink line and the wet line, then it seems to put it in the right place for everybody, and it points your chin, or it makes your chin flat. The mouthpiece between a quarter of an inch and a half of an inch in the mouth at approximately 30 degrees with the body. Keep your head up. So in terms of putting it into the mouth, the thing that I find more often than not is that people put too little mouthpiece in the mouth as opposed to too much. You can always tell if you put too much mouthpiece in the mouth because you just squeak all the time. And most of the time I find that they're not allowing the reed to vibrate enough. They need to put more in the mouth. The upper teeth on the mouthpiece. Now, one of the things that you can all get, most young students think that when you put your teeth on the top of the mouthpiece, it does tickle a little bit, and the vibrations tickle. You can get these mouthpiece patches. There are many different companies that make them that you put on the top of the mouthpiece. And there are several good things about this. One is that it takes away the tingle. The other is, kids, when they put anything in their mouth, they salivate like crazy. So when you put something in there that doesn't have a patch on the top, then it tends to move around quite a bit. With the patch there, that gives your teeth someplace to settle into. The other thing is the horn angle, and that is that, and this comes from a lot of it from high school marching band, and where we went the clarinet out too far. 30 degrees is accurate. 45, and it's going to get a really wild sound. Drawstring in the lips. So the smiling clarinet mouthpiece or clarinet embouchure went out with Eisenhower. You want to think that you have a drawstring in your lips that pulls your lips out and around the mouthpiece. The upper lip stays firm, pressing down on the mouthpiece and against the upper teeth. Breathe through the corners of the mouth. The teeth don't come off the mouthpiece when you're breathing. I remember teaching at a music camp in the Black Hills, Rushmore Music Camp, and there was a kid who looked like a Pez container because every time he took a breath, he and opened his mouth like that. Keep your teeth on the top and make your students keep the teeth on the top. Chin stains. I don't like this. I'm going to change this. The chin stays firm. I don't like pointed anymore. I told a kid recently to point his chin. He went like that and pointed at me. He was still all bunched up. The cheeks won't puff if you keep your corners firm. Now, those of us who circular breathe know that's not necessarily true, but we want to, with young kids, that's not going to be a problem. Upward pressure from the right thumb into the top teeth. I taught at West Texas State for a while with a remarkable band director named Gary Garner. And I used to watch him teach, and he would tell the students to push the mouthpiece up into the top teeth. And by keeping that firmness against the top teeth, it also keeps the firmness in the mouth and the embouchure, and it's remarkable what it does. No movable embouchures. They shouldn't be able to move around. And keep that head, I said that before, the angle. And the mouthpiece barrel combination should produce a concert F sharp. That you don't have to stop the tuner with that, but that's an idea. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this. We don't have that much time, but I do want to talk about the next section. Just talks about problems associated with the embouchure. Small stuffy sound, usually too much lower lip, and that's where you get the bunch chin touching the reed. Um, too too much lower lip in the mouth. Check the horn angle. Check the reed strength. We'll get to that in a little bit. Check the amount of mouthpiece in the mouth, and usually they're taking too little. Saliva in the sound. We all have heard that where it sounds like they're frying eggs in the back of the reed. Just most of the time that's caused by this, looking down the clarinet and keeping the horn angle up. My daughter played clarinet for a while, and she once I went in and watched her practice. She was sitting on the bed with her horn down like this, and the music in front of her, and it sounded terrible. So we took care of making sure that she had a music stand and a chair and everything. So make sure that the horn angle remains the same. The wild, uncontrolled sound. Usually the reed is too low. We tell the students, "Oh, you want to see a thin ribbon of black above the reed." Don't say that. Tell them to keep the reed even with the tip of the mouthpiece, because that thin ribbon gets wider and wider and wider and wider. Too little lower lip will do that. Too much mouthpiece in the mouth. There's a question.
Nope, they're not. Well, first was that still big
Okay.
takeaway, but then go Morningside, and then
Oh, yeah.
ASU go Sun Devils.
Okay, so the tongue is a real issue that we talk about all the time because we can't see in the mouth and we can't see what the tongue is always doing. So one of the problems that we have in a clarinet mostly is that people touch too much tongue to the reed. Now I'm gonna tell you all to just sit there with your mouths closed for a minute and just relax. And I'll keep talking, but close your mouths and just relax. You'll find when you are relaxed and your mouth is closed that the tongue is up against the roof of the mouth and the tip of the tongue is usually touching the bottom teeth. And that's usually where the tongue is. The tongue at rest is up against the roof of the mouth, and the tongue is forward in the mouth. So then we decide that we're going to play the clarinet, and what we do is we take this foreign object and put it in and say the tip of the tongue has to touch, and we end up shoving the reed back or the tongue back into the mouth. So the problem is finding where the tip of the tongue goes because it is a different position. So you can have a student scratch the tip of the tongue if their finger's clean in this coronavirus age. I don't know if I do that. Or they can take the tip of the tongue and rub it against the top teeth to feel where it is. Then you can tell them to place the tip of the tongue on the tip of the reed and bring the tongue into the mouth and form the embouchure and don't take the tongue off the reed. And have them go in and out without letting the tongue slip down the reed. That will help a great deal in getting the feel for having the tongue go back further. The tongue only stops the reed from vibrating. It doesn't necessarily stop the air. It just stops the vibration. John Moeller used to say, when you get to the stop sign, you turn your car off. And I said, no. He said, it's the same thing. Your tongue stops the reed from vibrating, but it doesn't stop the air. It's that little amount of reed or tongue on the reed to stop it from vibrating. Those of us who are clarinet players and grew up in the North know what it's like to have your lips get chapped in the winter and you start playing and a little bit of chapped lip skin gets stuck on the reed and it completely stops vibrating. That's how little it takes. The tip of the tongue. So anyway, I think I explained all of that there. Do not allow the embouchure to move on your tongue. You shouldn't see the like that, and you shouldn't see a lot of motion back here. That means the tongue is moving too far. If there's a lot of in the sound when they're tonguing, it just means they're touching too much tongue to the reed. They just need to touch less tongue to the reed, and the above ideas should help with that. There should be no pitch change during articulations. That's the kind of doink articulation where you're opening your mouth while you're tonguing at the same time, and the pitch goes up and down. The big thing is that the student needs to be aware of the correct way of articulation, and the above steps can help. My colleague Josh Gardner has a really great exercise he does. If you touch the reed and keep the sound going like a subtone while you're playing, the actual subtone goes up slightly if your tongue is in the right place and if you're touching the tip of the tongue to the tip of the reed. If you're touching down too far, the pitch goes down. Those of your clarinetists, try this. It's amazing. It does work. Air, the basis of tone. This is kind of a weird concept, the whole concept of air. But I like to think of the air as being like a laser beam as opposed to jello. It doesn't necessarily have to be always a huge volume of air you're putting through, but it should be intense. Now, one of the things that we do, my colleague Josh Gardner has done a lot of mapping of the tongue using ultrasound. And one of the things we notice is the tongue is not always where we think it is in the mouth when we're playing. Um, I will make some of those videos available in a Dropbox folder, or I'll send them to TNMEA, a link to that so you can see. But one of the things that we do try to do is to keep the tongue up in the mouth so we can control the intensity of the airstream. Hand position and finger motion, and this is getting into a little bit of the whole technical aspect of what I was talking about earlier. And we'll also get into a section later kind of about how the brain works and how our fingers work. Um, the instrument should be played with the pads of the fingers, not the tips. So one of the issues that we have with our students is that they want to play like this, and it has to be more like this, like a collapsed C. So if you tell the students to drop their hands to the side and then pick them up, you'll see it's kind of a collapsed C in both hands, and that's the correct hand position. The other thing are the thumbs. And I one of the things about the left thumb, if you can think of it as aiming at about 2 o'clock on an imaginary clock face back here, your thumb will be in the right position. I have some pictures later showing this. And the thumb position on the bottom is another one. I have very short fingers. And because of that, I put my thumb rest in a different spot than someone who has very long fingers. I wouldn't be too insistent about where they put that thumb rest. As long as their fingers are in the right spot here, then it's going to go to the right place on the thumb rest. We have some questions that I'll get to in just a second. Um, the left hand index finger should roll back to play the A key, not pick it up and move. Yes?
Bigger.
Oh, okay. I'll make it a little bigger. Sorry. There you go. And this will also be sent to you. Um, the You should roll back from F sharp to A, and there are a lot of exercises you can do to that. And when your hand is like this, the left hand, it should actually almost be touching the G sharp key on the side. You can feel that with your finger. Uh, on the right hand, one of the things that I did when I was a kid was I jammed my finger in here and actually tried to support the clarinet with my finger. The right hand does not support the clarinet with the first or the index finger. It should rest next to or slightly above, and in my case, it usually rests slightly above the E flat, B flat key. I talked about the thumb at the 2 o'clock position. Finger motion, the fingers should always remain close to the keys when you're playing. There should never be a lot of waving. And it's like, I use the analogy that if you wanted to hit something many times really quickly, you wouldn't go like this. You would stay as close as you can. The same thing is with the finger motion. One of the things that I really highly recommend is to have your students, when they can, particularly as they get more advanced, practice in front of a full-length mirror, and they can see what the fingers are doing. And I have done that for years, practicing in front of a full-length mirror to see what my fingers do when I'm warming up in the morning. And it's remarkable. You can tell when you start getting into bad habits and things start to move too far. Mirror practice. Tuning. So tuning in a clarinet is a really strange thing now, because we have different pitch centers around the world now. The United States still tries to stay at A440, although like at Arizona State, all of our pianos seem to be tuned to 441 now. When you get to Europe, it's 442. In some cases, it's 444. And a lot of bands maybe start at 442, and by the time they get warmed up, they're at 444. So the pitch is really different now around the world. And therefore, clarinets are made, particularly the clarinets made in Paris, are made at different at a pitch that will work for all markets. They can't make one clarinet for an American market and one clarinet for the rest of the world. So the clarinets are made in order to be a little more flexible. What you'll find in many high-end clarinets is they'll come with a variety of barrels to use at different lengths. But for student line clarinets, you're more than likely going to have to pull a little bit at the barrel. So tuning open G by adjusting between the barrel and the upper joint. C's, which is the third line, the third space C should be tuned by pulling in the middle. Now, the problem with that is that we don't want to tune the open G so it's exactly in tune because the throat tones ride a little sharp. So the next thing you can do is check the E below that open G. And if that E has gone flat, you've pulled way too far. You can keep your open G a little sharp, and you're going to teach them how to bring it down by putting the right hand fingers down, which we'll talk about in a minute. Venting and dampening and mouth throat motion should be used to fine tune pitch, and we'll get to that in a second. Upper register production. Now, here's one thing that you can do. If the students are having a hard time, you know how they get up to clarion G and then everything becomes a subtone. If you have them take a little more mouthpiece in the mouth at the beginning, they'll be able to get those pitches to come out. It increases the size of the oral cavity enough that these pitches will work. Think of keeping the tongue in an E position. It doesn't always remain there, but if you think of that, it will open the oral cavity enough to help those work. Kids try to bite. Tell them not to bite. The more they bite, the worse it'll get. And then bugle calls. And I'll just give an example, not of bugle calls, of overblowing. If you have the kids play a clarion G and then work up and take everything off and get an open G and then take it back down to a G, open D and take it back down to a G. By going back and forth then between they'll be able to get the feeling of what it takes. And you can do that F sharp, F natural, E, E flat, and D, overblowing to the corresponding clarion note. And articulation in the upper register actually requires much less tongue motion and contact than those in the lower register. Are there some questions?
Yeah, there's a question from someone who's a jazz musician, agreeing with mostly what you say, and but he also says is that, what are your thoughts concerning the two embouchure horn angle difference for jazz and classical?
Well, Benny Goodman and all those people, I saw Benny Goodman live a number of times toward the end of his life, and he played with a normal angle. What you saw a lot of times in the movies was this over exaggeration of things. I think that a lot of what you have when you're playing a different style is a different kind of way of the tongue position in the mouth, giving a fatter sound. But I don't think that the horn angle in that should change. I think everything should remain the same. If you look at there's a YouTube video of Artie Shaw playing the Artie Shaw Concerto with his orchestra. It's from a movie, and he's got his horn way out like this, but he's also not playing. I mean, everything is lip synced or finger synced or whatever that would be called. So I think keep the horn angle the same, and you can accomplish the same thing. And the students, if you give them recordings to listen to and work with them in vibrato, the sound is going to work as well.
There is a comment about tongue position. Liz says, I found it helpful to point out to clarinet students and band directors that clarinet tongue position is different than other instruments.
Yeah, it is. Like I was talking about earlier, my colleague Josh Gardner has done all this mapping with ultrasound, and whenever I talk about tongue position, I'm always scared because he's gonna prove me wrong. But the idea is that the tongue does remain in a different position. When I was teaching at West Texas State, I taught a band director in the area who was a trumpet player, and every time he went down to a low register, he tried to drop his tongue, and it just didn't work. The tongue is different, and what happens in the back of the mouth? This is going to get a little complex, but I'll just get into it a little bit. Every note that you play on the clarinet, the soft tissue in the mouth and throat take on a slightly different position. Every note, and what happens if you watch back here when I did that exercise earlier. You can see that motion back there. That's the tongue moving in the throat. And I don't know what that sounds like with this crazy mic. I apologize, but every note, it takes on a slightly different position, and doing those bugle calls really helps the students find the right tongue position. Reed placement and reeds. I got really mad at reeds in 1986, and I decided that I was going to make all my own reeds, which I do. So it's hard for me to talk about commercial reeds now, but some things are really easy. If the reed is too hard, the sound is airy and it's hard to blow, and it can cause severe embouchure problems. If the reed is too soft, the sound is buzzy and the high notes are flat if difficult, if not impossible to produce. Reeds have really come a long way since 1986 when I got mad at them and decided just to make my own. But uh, pick a good national brand for your students, and also mouthpiece selection does affect the reed selection. One reed doesn't fit all. And in particular, Van Doren mouthpieces have a chart that will show you what kind of reed works for that. Slow practice, we're going to get to in a minute, and I'm going to come back to that. Warm up, I talked about a little bit. The importance of a daily warm up and practice routine cannot be overemphasized. Um, there are a variety of things. I think you need to work on sound in a warm up. You need to work on finger motion in a warm up, and you need to work on articulation. One of the things that I found with my long tones, I do them with a metronome because long tones become short tones really fast. So you want to make sure that you're actually holding the note for the number of beats or number of seconds that you want. And I also have included in the handouts that you'll get a clarinet warm up that I use. Equipment. Is there another question before we?
Well, there was a question. What do you look for in the sound or physically to tell if a student is biting?
Uh, uh, well, normally you can tell physically by just looking at them. You can see the biting. Although I've had a lot of students that claim they're biting like crazy and they feel it and everything looks remarkable. I think one of the things you can do is to check whether if they play a low C, then you just reach behind them and press the register key and then press the G sharp key, and it should go from an E to a C to a G, or to an E. Sorry, altissimo E. Let me say it. C G E. There we go. And if they're biting a lot, that's not going to happen. It's not going to work. So that's one thing. Um, Equipment. This is all very basic kind of stuff, but one of the things I notice with young students is that the tone holes get dirty really quickly. And the other thing is teach a specific way of assembling the clarinet. That a lot of the things that I find when I'm working with young students that are messed up is because they've bent keys because they're just cramming things together. So if you can teach a way that allows them to put the instrument together the best possible way without bending keys and with I have a specific method that I use, but it's just very important to keep that in mind. This is one of my students. Her name's Taylor Sturm, and she's a senior this year. And when Josh and I were putting this clinic together for AMEA, I needed some new pictures. And so I looked at her playing one day and I thought, wow, she's like picture perfect embouchure. She almost plays right in the center of her face, which is really unusual. I certainly don't, and most clarinetists I know don't. But this gives you an idea. You can show students about firm upper lip, firm corners, firm chin, and a lower lip placement. This is a good angle, and if you look at the chin on this picture, she has a great chin, and then some hand position. I picked her because her hands are really they were very photogenic. Some examples of venting and dampening are there. If you have students who are constantly sharp or constantly flat on certain notes, um, I played in an orchestra for 18 years in Ohio, in Columbus, and I found every time I played an F with another woodwind player who will remain anonymous, I found that my F was flat and I had to add my E flat key in order to bring that up. If you're a clarinet player and you're playing the Brahms trio with cello, you find at the end of the first movement, your low A is incredibly sharp. You can add your F sharp, C sharp key to lower that. So these are just some examples. You should teach, and I mentioned this earlier for your students, anytime they're playing the throat tones, try to figure out a combination of fingers on the left and right hand that will bring them down. You can also find resonance fingerings that work. Certain fingerings will bring out a resonance in the sound that's quite a bit different than what they had with that kind of airy quality, particularly the throat tone B flat. For those of you who aren't clarinetists, uh, I have this new clarinet. It's a Selmer Presence, and it has an extra A flat E flat key on the side. I've never had one of those before, and so I'm almost afraid to use it. So I don't have to slide anymore. But if you have to slide, always teach them to slide down or out, never in or up. And there's a great exercise, example 6, for teaching alternate fingerings where you're going, particularly E, F, F sharp, E, F, F sharp, where you're going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, which will really help. The bugle calls with the stopped horn, you won't be able to see this, but if you sit back and plug the bell in your calf, you can actually get by fingering a B natural. Let's try a C. And that's just by moving my throat and moving the tongue in my throat. I'm not moving my fingers at all. So that's what the bugle calls using a stop bell means. Long tones, those are just some, those are the long tones I use every day. I do those with a tuner at 60. And then patterning, we're going to get into in just a second, but not, and I'll come back and refer to those. So those are some arpeggios, thirds. They all have fingerings in them with the patterns that we use, and I'll explain why in a second. There's some tongue studies there. I'm going to stop sharing this particular document and go to another one. Okay, just a moment. When I first started teaching, the instrument companies used to send out. There we go. Used to send out documents all the time and little pamphlets, and they were incredible pamphlets to read and to learn from. I mean, LeBlanc sent out a whole bunch of things about how to play your E flat in tune and the contrabass clarinet and how to play that, and they were remarkable things. Selmer had a bunch of stuff that was published by the Selmer Company, and it was called the Selmer Bandwagon. It was the LeBlanc Bell and the Selmer Bandwagon. And we used to get these things in the mail all the time. And I kept them for many years, and this was one of my favorites. And it is called Mind, Muscle, and Music, Physiological Cues to Better Teaching. So I used it for years, and I handed it out to people until I realized I had only one left. And just that week, and this is purely by chance, I happened to see that our guitar teacher was bringing, this was at ASU, was bringing someone in who was now considered an expert in musicians' injuries, and his name was Frank Wilson, MD. So I went to his clinic, and I said, "Are you the same Frank Wilson that wrote this?" And he looked at that and he said, "Oh my goodness, where did you find that?" And I said, "Well, this is my last one. I was hoping you could get me some more." And he said, I don't even know how to find them." So I called Count Selmer and I said, "Do you have any of these?" They said they didn't know where to find them, and they gave me permission to scan this one in. And so I scanned this copy in, and I've been passing it out to anybody who is interested in it. And it's sort of, you can go to the bookstore and you get those books like Windows for Dummies or Macs for Dummies or whatever. This is sort of like how your brain works for dummies. And when I started reading this, it hit me just like a ton of bricks. I couldn't believe what I was reading and how so much of it was applicable to my teaching. And so I'm going to just go into the major aspects of this booklet. This is an easy booklet to read. Uh, my students tell me it's great bathroom reading. But in any event, what it talks about is that in order for anything to happen, your brain sends a signal to a muscle, and the muscle contracts, and that's what you see right in this picture right here. That the brain sends a signal and the muscle contracts, and so when we're playing an instrument, the brain sends a signal and it tells a finger to do something like this, to move in a certain way. The problem is that our brains can't do that many things at once. Our brains can do 20 things a second. And that's the reason that movies work. That when you're watching a movie, particularly the old film movies, if you can think in that direction for now, the frames went by at more than 20 times a second. And those of you who are my age remember when it would slow down and something would happen and it would become like that kind of a motion as opposed to a fluid motion. And that was as a result of the frames slowing down. But if your brain can only comprehend 20 things a second, when it goes beyond that, it sees a blur. And so what we need to do when we play clarinet is many times we're actually, or any instrument, but in clarinet in particular, or a woodwind instrument, something that has something to do with technique with the fingers, many times we're doing more than 20 things a second. So let's take, I'll pick a great clarinet piece, the Weber Polacca. Those of you who don't know it, you should. It's the Weber Second Clarinet Concerto, the last movement. And the last page, which is the last page of most editions, has, I like to play it at about a metronome marking of 120, and you have literally six notes in every beat. So it's so that means every half second you're playing six notes. So it means every second you're playing 12 notes. So you have 12 things going on every second. Then on top of that, you're standing up. And, those of us who have children and watching them learn to walk and learn to stand, remember what it was like at the beginning when they stood up and they looked like they had too much to drink and then they fell. And then they pulled themselves up against the coffee table and you were scared to death they were going to bash their noses into their brains if they fell and they would fall again. And so finally, you could see what was going on, that they were learning how to balance themselves. Now, so when we play clarinet, we're doing the same thing. We're balancing ourselves, we're playing. So we have 12 things going on a second, and then we have the other aspect of it, we're trying to stand up. And of course, there's always the person sitting in the front row who decides, I think I'm going to have a piece of candy now, but I'm going to open it really slowly so I don't bother anybody. And you hear, so the brain is going on like that. Then there's inevitably the baby who decides to cry in the back row, and all of a sudden that startles. So you're verging on 20 things every second, which your brain can't do. So there's a part of your brain called the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is back here in the back, right there. And what the cerebellum does is it when you do something over and over and over again, the cerebellum programs that information in, and it starts to learn that you want to do that certain motion. But it doesn't take every individual motion. It doesn't say, oh, he wants to lift this finger and then this finger and then this finger. It says, oh, he just wants to do this. And that one movement becomes one bit of information in the cerebellum. So as you learn, then you are able to do more than 20 things a second by the cerebellum shooting out groups of information as opposed to individual motions. So that to give you an example of how the cerebellum works, the cerebellum is non-judgmental, and it doesn't judge whether it's right or wrong. It only judges you're doing this over and over again. So because you're doing all this over and over again, you must be willing to learn it. So this is how I get to Clarinet Technique 101. At this point, you have to realize how important it is to practice something accurately at slow tempos and accurately so that all the motion is accurate. So as you increase the motion, it continues to be accurate. If you want to, so I'll go through the practice aspect first and then a way that you can test your cerebellum. So if you're practicing that particular passage, you do very slowly at the beginning. So the finger motion is exactly what you want it to be. Then you gradually increase the tempo. And as you gradually increase the tempo, you retain the accuracy. Now, the reason to practice it slowly is so you have it accurate at the beginning. If you don't have it accurate at the beginning and you increase the tempo, it's going to be inaccurate at faster tempos. And we all know what that's like when we get to a performance and we all of a sudden realize, I can't play this right now. And so we haven't practiced it slowly and accurately enough. Because the cerebellum is non-judgmental, if you've done it 98 times incorrectly, then you get it correct twice. It's going to more than likely pull out of those 98 wrong times when you actually get to the performance. So this is why it's important to do it slowly at the beginning. So the cerebellum, this part of your brain, can learn at the very beginning what it is that you want accurate. So if you want to test your cerebellum, there are a couple of ways. Next time you have a performance or you're playing something that's not important, it may be a practice session or whatever. What I do quite often, I'll have my students listen to me play something. And I'll play something through for them. And what I find immediately is I start to think too much. I start to think about my fingers. I start to think, what is my tongue doing? What am I doing with my embouchure? All these things. And so what you start doing is you shift away from the thinking of the cerebellum back to the thinking of your fingers. And things are going too rapidly for you then to play, and of course you mess up. So then when you get to the point where you quit thinking, it shoves it back to the cerebellum, and the technique becomes much more fluid. The other thing you can do is the next time you're going downstairs, make sure your hands are free, and start to think about what you're doing when you're going downstairs, and you'll almost stumble. because you're going downstairs is just a controlled fall. But we've learned to do that, and our cerebellum just does it. We can walk and chew gum and go downstairs at the same time. But if you start thinking, it doesn't work. There's a question.
Actually, a comment. Slow practice is so important for accuracy and retention for all instruments.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And this slow practice, this is why it works. And this is one of the things that has always hit me about this booklet. This means our idea of why we practice slowly and all of that. This is why it works. It works because of the cerebellum back here. We're training that. That gives you an example in here. Let's see, I'll keep going here. Of this piece, this piano piece. And this is from Brahms' second piano concerto. And if you look at all the things going on at once, obviously that's more than 20 things a second. He makes a statement in here that I'm not sure I agree with, particularly on clarinet playing. And he said that well, let me read this with you right now, this particular paragraph. Let me give you two small examples of what I mean. Slow practice is the key to rapid technical progress. The cerebellum is a non-judgmental part of the brain. It assumes that any repetitive activity in the muscular system is being repeated because the conscious mind is trying to make it automatic. The cerebellum will be just as effective in automatic or incorrect sequences of timing as those that are correct. When practicing takes place at a pace too fast for accurate playing, there's very little chance for the material to be mastered. And reliable, confident performance simply will not occur. This is the part that I'm not sure I understand. On the other hand, it is probably true that practice for speed is seldom necessary. The cerebellum can supply all the speed wanted if patterning is correct during practice. For me, that's never worked. I have to work things up because I think when we're playing an instrument, particularly as a clarinetist, when you're playing rapid, there's a different feel to the keys when you're playing slowly. I know if I'm playing something slow, you actually feel all the keys. You feel what it is. When you're playing rapidly, I'm not sure that you actually have that same tactile sensation. With my students, quite often, we start every lesson with long tones, scales, thirds, arpeggios because of all that work I did back in 1979. And one of the things is that students will sometimes get in the middle of a set of thirds and just can't play them. And I just look at them and I say, quit thinking. Or you go up in front of them and you wave your hand in front of their face or touch them on the shoulder or something, then they can play it because you've flustered them enough that they quit thinking. That's now going back to the other document that I was sharing, and I know I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm gonna go kind of rapidly. Oh, I have to. I really don't like Zoom. we, we've been teaching off this all through the end of the semester, and it's very difficult. So when we get back into this section here of patterns, if you teach your students specific patterns from the beginning, so you start with all of these things. If you teach them with a C major scale at the beginning, that they play a left hand B and a right hand C, and they keep their finger down for the C, then you have that pattern set. And those of us who are clarinetists, sometimes switch between playing a C major scale and an E major scale, and there's actually a different position you put your hand in for the different scales because of the patterning you've learned. And it's important if you can keep one pattern until you have to change it, then you will, I think technique helps. The hardest key to play in for me is D major, because you have a choice of playing the B here and the C sharp here, or the B here and the C sharp here. So I end up playing the B with the left and the C sharp with the right almost every time, and that's in these scales. There's a question.
Yeah. How do you help students who overthink technical studies, scales, chords, thirds, when under pressure?
That's just what I was saying. They're thinking too much. And what I do is I think you actually have to train them not to. And in the early days of my teaching and playing, I would play a recital, and in the middle of it, I used to tell my wife I lost my fingers. And you just get into a section, and all of a sudden you start thinking about it. What I do, what I tell my students is that this is kind of funny. I go to my happy place. So my grandparents on my father's side, my grandfather worked for Detroit Edison, and then they moved to Ann Arbor at one point and bought a farm. He still worked for Detroit Edison. And when they retired, they moved to Green Lake up at Interlochen, Michigan. and they bought a bunch of lots up there, and they built a cabin or built a year-round residence. And one of my greatest memories of my childhood was out on the lake in an inner tube in the summer, and the whole world floating by. And I actually go to that spot when I get to a really technical spot. And if you've practiced, and if the student has practiced correctly enough and done enough slow practice, if they can get themselves to stop thinking about something like that, they can get through it. For me, it works, and for my students, it works. And as a teacher, what you can do is to distract them completely when they get to that spot. Go in front of them, make faces, do anything, and you'll find that they can get through it by not thinking about it. There was another question?
Just a comment.
Okay. Okay. So, so here are some patterning exercises here, and just some ideas of the fingerings that I teach, and Dr. Garner teaches as well. Um, all the major scales, and then the arpeggios, and thirds, chromatic scales, and a warm-up exercise here. Um, I find even today, and I'm laughing because I turned 65 this month, and even now I practice 4 hours every day, and it's difficult for me still to think about my fingers and to think about technical progress. One of the advantages I have as a teacher is, and as a performer, is I actually really like to practice, and it's really important to me to have my time every day to practice. And when we were raising our daughter, she knew that during my time that I was practicing, it was not really a good time to go bother daddy, because it was important to me to practice. And the time that I really like, and it's my time every day, is the time that I spend practicing and working through things slowly. So if you can encourage your students to find this time and to find it to be something that is enjoyable for them, then it's a much more enjoyable time, and then the learning process does work better. The other thing is that I practice really slowly, and I work things up really slowly. I probably spend way too much time learning pieces, but I find once I learn them that I can play them all the time. I mean, it doesn't take that much time to get all of it back. There,
Well, it was that biggest takeaways from learning how to practice.
yeah, learning how to practice, and I use the metronome. I have my Dr. Beat back here on my desk, and I subdivide, or I do use my Dr. Beat all the time. That's an old one. That's the DB66. I like it because it's loud, and and I use my Dr. Beat to practice. I think it's really effective to keep the technique going. And the other thing I wanted to just touch on really briefly in the last couple of minutes is that one of the things I've been learning in the last few years is how to play a little better in tune. And one of the things I do is we start every lesson with long tones in the studio, and we have a drone going. And the drone, I change the pitch from week to week with the student. And and I find by playing with a drone, the student is made aware of where the pitch center is, and they can generally hear where to put things, how to lower a third, how to put a fifth and a fourth in the right place, how unisons have to work, and how to listen for beats. And I do that. I also have my tuner on my phone, and all my students I encourage to have to get a tuner on the phone that they can watch and use during practice. But I don't like the idea of looking at the pitch. I like the idea of listening to the pitch. I think that music in this age, which is a strange time, I think we can agree for all of us, music is still a very, very important part of what we do. I don't think that in the future, like when we look back on the ancient Greeks and the Romans, we're not talking about, well, we talk about their political system a little bit, but we're not talking about their politics as a day-to-day thing. We're talking about their art, about their incredible statues. When we look at the Renaissance, we're not talking about all of the things that were happening then politically. We're looking at the gorgeous Renaissance art and the fact that we were beginning to evolve with music, with organum, and then with early polyphony, and then Bach. I, I think that what we have now is a time to work with our students in order to continue to create beauty. And I think we give our students something that the rest of everything else can't do. How this is going to work in coronavirus age, I don't know. I don't know how we're going to go back in the fall. We are going back full time in person, and I'm not sure how lessons are going to work that way. But I do have to say, I think that we create something beautiful for the students. And I think if we can keep that in mind as we go through this next period of time, I, I think it's going to keep us all alive and keep us moving forward. I know I'm nowhere near ready to retire. And I'm hoping that you all have the same ideas about pushing forward and increasing the whole idea of music education. Were there any other questions, Lynette?
No.
Do any of you have any other questions you can send in right now? We've got about 4 minutes left. Nothing? I can't see even who's on here, so I'm just talking to my computer screen as far as I know.
There is a 15-second delay, so it'll take a second.
Okay, so I have, I will read this while we're waiting for any comments. Tune in weeknights, Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central Time. That should be Central Daylight Time, to watch Keeping the Beat live. And remember to tell your friends about our program. Tomorrow night will be James Stevens, Director of Advocacy and Educational Resources. Music for All, the session topic, Advocacy in Action. Presenters who wish to apply to host an episode send applications via tnmea.org. Thanks for watching, and thank you very much for including me in this. I really appreciate it. We have a couple questions.
Just comments.
Well, just comments. I really appreciate all of you watching. I hope you're watching. I can't tell. And keep the faith. We'll emerge from this. Keep your face masks on.
There's one quick one.
Okay.
What are your favorite lesser-known solos for high school and undergraduates?
Lesser known solos. Okay. Instead of, we don't have much time now. Email me. My email address is real easy. rspring, like Robert Spring, rspring@asu.edu, or robert.spring@asu.edu, and I'll send you some ideas that I have. I haven't been teaching high school kids for a long time, but I keep in touch with things by doing some adjudicating and that, and so I still have an idea. And there's a lot of new good repertoire that's coming out for kids, so we don't have to have them do the same things. Are there any more?
Thank you.
Okay, boss, may I finish? Type and let me know. Yes, we can sign off now. Thank you, everybody. Good night. Stay healthy.